Hello everyone, I am Dr. Deepak Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities, the Bhopal School of Social Sciences. In this series of lecture on the constitutional history of India, today we are going to discuss the second part of the Government of India Act 1935. Now if you remember, in the last lecture, we discussed the background of the 1935 Act. We discussed how John Simon's commission and its report, and then later roundtable conferences, and then white paper and the report of the Joint Select Committee of the British Parliament was crucial for the enactment of the 1935 Act. So in last lecture we discussed the background. In this lecture we are going to discuss the major provisions. So a quick review. This act is very unique because before this act, all the previous acts of British Parliament had a preamble, but this act contrasted sharply with the previous acts because the preamble, there was no preamble in this act. The 1935 Act seemed devoid of it. Now if you also remember that previous act's preamble says that the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. Now this was stated in the preamble of the previous act by Edwin Montagu, who was the Secretary of State. And this particular act of 1935 is devoid of any preamble. Now there are many interpretations of this. We will not go into the detail of this interpretation. So we will discuss the importance, major provisions of this act. Now during this period, Indian demands were creating around the British India being accorded a constitutional parity with the other existing dominions, for example Australia, Canada, Irish Free State, New Zealand and the Union of South Africa, which would have meant complete autonomy in the British Commonwealth. So if you remember, in the last century, Indians were demanding constitutional reforms. Now they are demanding dominion status, and we'll see in a few moments or in few years in the next coming acts that Indians will start demanding total independence. Now salient features of the Government of India Act 1935 are like, one of the major provisions of this act was the division of subjects of All India Federation. Now in this act, All India Federation was recommended. It says that the establishment of an All India Federation consisting of provinces and princely states as unit. It's like similar to modern day India or to modern day USA. So it recommended federalism, whereas states or provinces will act as units and there will be a center or a union working at the central level or the federal level. The act divided the powers between the center and the units, let's call it provinces or states. Now three lists were suggested. So powers were divided or distributed between provinces and the state through these three lists. The approach to form the federation and implement provincial autonomy paved the way for the division of the subjects between center and the provinces. Now all the important subjects were given to the center and all the provincial level important subjects were given to the provinces. Now the act says the division of subjects that were given the Government of India Act 1919 was revised and it added some more subjects in it by the Act of 1935. What does it mean? It means the previous Act of 1919, if you remember, also introduced diarchy in the provincial level, where similar list kinds of things were introduced. At provincial level, diarchy, because of the diarchy, transferred subjects and reserved subjects were introduced. Now diarchy was abolished in this Act, in this Act of 1935, and diarchy was introduced at the central level. So at central level, these subjects were introduced. So it says that federal list, which had 59 items, where federal government will make laws. Provincial list, where provinces will make laws for the provinces, and for 54 items were included in this list. Then there was a concurrent list including 36 items. Now, concurrent list means that both federal level legislatures and provincial legislatures both can make laws on these 36 items. Then there was a residuary powers on which there is no consensus yet. In future, whenever there will be consensus, according to the laws will be made on these areas. Now, subjects which were all India interest and demanded uniform treatment were put in the federal list. And only the federal legislature could make laws on the federal subjects. Subjects of mainly local interest or the provincial interest were placed in the provincial list and were wholly within the jurisdiction of the province's legislature for the purpose of legislation. And of course, the concurrent list, as discussed, that it would include all the federal level and the provincial level legislatures. Hence, the Act authorized both the federal and provincial legislature to pass laws on those subjects. So, this was done at the central level. Diarchy was abolished at the provincial level, diarchy was introduced or reintroduced at the federal level. This Act also provided provincial autonomy. The Act says that diarchy should be abolished in the provinces and introduced at the provincial autonomy. Now, provinces will have autonomy in their legislature. Provinces were also allowed to act as autonomous units, as in their administration will be in their hand. Their spheres were defined. Moreover, the Act also introduced responsible governments in the provinces, which meant that the governor was required to act with the advice of ministers responsible to the provincial legislature, whereas in the previous Act, if you remember, this responsibility was lacking. This, however, does not mean that the Act of 1935 established a full-fledged responsible government in the provinces. The ministers were not absolutely free. In matter of running their departments, they had some restrictions. The government continued to possess a set of overriding powers, although such powers were not exercised very often. Another important provision introduced by this Act was the bicameralism at the central and also at the provincial level. Now, bicameralism means two house or two parts. So, legislature of Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam and UP were made bicameral, which will consist of legislative council or call it a upper house and legislative assembly, call it a lower house. It is like modern day India's Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, but at the provincial level. Under the Government of India Act 1935, central legislature was bicameral, consisting of Federal Assembly and the Council of States. Now, this is actually similar to the modern day India's Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha. Here, Federal Assembly was made similar to modern days Lok Sabha and Council of States was made similar to that of modern days Rajya Sabha. The Council of State was to be made upper house and a permanent body with 1/3 of its membership retiring every 3rd year. It was to consist of 260 members. The Federal Assembly was made the lower house with a tenure of 5 years. It would include 375 members. Now, this is very important because this bicameralism, introduction of this bicameralism signifies in our history of Indian Constitution, because modern days Indian Constitution is based upon this Act only. The foundation of modern day Indian Constitution is based on the provisions provided by the Act of 1935. Diarchy at the center. It also provided the adoption of diarchy at the center, where reserved subjects and transferred subjects were divided in the federal subjects. However, the provisions of this act did not come into operation at all, so we can ignore this point. Religious affairs, defense, administration of tribal areas, external affairs, these are the important reserved subjects, whereas all the other subjects were included in the transferred subjects. Governor General remained overall in charge of the both reserved as well as the transferred subjects. This Act of 1935 introduced class representation. If you remember, the previous Act had already this provision where communal representation was introduced, but this Act provided for separate electorates for depressed classes, that is scheduled class, for women and for laborers, even though laborers and workers did not demand it. It further extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorate under the Act. The Muslim got the 33% in the federal legislature. So these were the important provisions provided by this Act. Now let's discuss other important features given in this Act. This Act abolished the Council of India. Council of India, or the India Council, which was established by the Government of India Act 1858. Now, instead of Council of India, the Secretary of State in London will have a team of advisors. The Act also provided for the establishment of Reserve Bank of India, the Federal Bank of India, which later became the Reserve Bank of India. The franchise was extended further to from 3% to 14%. This is very important, although the number were few, but still it's very important provision, because now at least 14% of the Indian population could cast their vote instead of 3% from the previous Act. The Act also provided for the establishment of the Federal Public Service Commission, Provincial Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission. It provided for the establishment of Federal Court, which later became Supreme Court of India, and it was set up in 1937. This Act gave the authority and command of the railways in India in the hands of a newly established body known as the Federal Railway, which will consist of 7 members who were free from the control of the councillors and ministers. The Act also provided an important feature, that was the reorganization of certain parts, including the Sindh being carved out of Bombay Presidency, splitting of Bihar and Odisha, and the cutting of Burma from India. Now, significance of the Act. This Act is very significant because this Act is one of the last Act before India's independence was decided. It's a second milestone towards the complete responsible government in India after the Act of 1919. One of the lengthiest Act, which included 321 sections and 10 schedules. The Government of India Act 1935 marks a point of no return in the history of constitutional development in India. This Act curtailed the powers concentrated in the hands of the central government and distributed it by ensuring that a decentralized form of government shapes away in India. It also provided for separate electorate for women, which was a huge step in that period. The proposal for setting up the Federation of India did not materialize, and central government in India continued to be governed by the provisions of the Act of 1919. However, the establishment of Federal Bank and the Federal Court was significant. The provincial autonomy is also important, which came into force in 1937. Eventually, this Act culminated in the fact that of the dominion status, which urged the need for independence again in the minds of the people. So this was major provisions and the significance of the 1935 Act. Thank you.